Alright, I don't want to waste any time. I want to start talking about these gameplay details as soon as possible. So right now, I am at E3 2019, and I had the honor and the privilege of attending a 20-minute Dying Light 2 gameplay demo. There were about 25 of us, I think, in the room. Once again, it was about 20 minutes long, with the lead game designer, Timon Smektala, occasionally commentating on what was happening and giving us some context. And at the end, there was a brief Q&A session, and then I got to have a one-on-one interview with one of the producers of the game, Caldwell. So I just want to give a quick summary of the story without any spoilers, because I did get to witness some key decisions that I do consider to spoil some things, so I'm not going to go into specifics. I don't want to spoil anything about the story. I just want to give you a quick spoiler-free summary, and then we can talk about gameplay mechanics and the nitty-gritty details, of which I have about 10 pages written about. So it starts off in this club that's called the Fish Eye. It has amazing atmosphere. The lighting is fantastic. Everyone's drinking, dancing, listening to music, and I believe this is located in District 2. There are 7 districts in the city, so do keep that in mind. Now, what you're doing here at this club is you're helping to arrange a meeting between the peacekeepers, the scavengers, and the renegades in order to sort out a pretty important situation. Drinking water is about to run out for the whole district, so you've got 3 factions here trying to work things out, and things very quickly go sour, and all of a sudden people are beating the shit out of each other. You're not entirely sure how it started. You don't get to see it on screen, but you have to just rush and get involved, which leads to a human versus human combat situation where the player gets to, beat some humans, and the human versus human combat is improved, which I'll touch on in just a moment. But this section ended with some friendly NPCs being seriously injured. The player was then prompted with a decision to pursue the attackers from a certain faction or stay and help your friends at the Fish Eye. So in this particular demo, the player chose to pursue the truck that the enemies from one of the factions were escaping in. Now, I say enemies, but they did note that Caldwell, who is the character that you play, he is sort of a middleman. He's in the middle ground. He's not strongly aligned with any faction. So when I say enemies, I just mean, in this particular case, this is the faction that we're pursuing. So it was a bit of a journey to catch up to the truck that they were escaping in, and the player did run into quite a few obstacles along the way, including a dark zone that was full of zombies. But eventually the player did catch up and managed to get inside of the truck, where the player was presented with an opportunity to either kick the driver out of the vehicle or simply threaten him. Now, the player in this case chose to threaten the driver and tell him, drive me to the enemy base. He also came up with another decision to, hey, radio your guys, tell them everything's okay, tell them to let us through the gates. And the voice acting from this guy actually was very good. The driver, he was a quirky sort of like stoner character with an American accent. Most of the characters either have American accents or Australian accents, and the voice acting all around was very good from the NPCs, from the protagonist as well. You're playing as Caldwell, who is voiced by Jonah Scott. I know when you hear his voice, he's going to sound a little bit like a younger Roger Craig Smith. Jonah, I suppose you can take that as a compliment, because we all know how great Roger Craig Smith is, and I'm looking forward to hearing more from you, Jonah. So the voice acting is good, but keep in mind, it is not the same voice actor. It is not Kyle Crane, so do keep that in mind. So the voice acting was great. Actually, something real quick that I forgot to mention was that during this driving scene in the truck, you actually did see some deer walking around, some wildlife. So I'm interested in asking them about how the wildlife will come into play. I'm wondering if we can hunt them. This is one of the questions I plan on answering. I've got a couple interviews coming out after this that will answer a bunch of the questions you guys will probably still have after this. So don't worry, I'm going to answer your questions as best as I can. And eventually, the player did get inside the enemy base. And at this point, Timon Smektala took a moment to remind us, like, hey, this would have been a bit more difficult if we had decided to kick that driver out of the vehicle. You would have to find a way to sneak into this base. Whereas, since we were with the driver and we managed to get him to cooperate, we actually got to sneak in right through the front gates, hiding in plain sight, essentially. So this leads to a bit of a stealth section in this faction's base. And if I had one criticism about I have a few criticisms about the first game that I've voiced on this channel. One of them is that there was some stealth in the first game, but it didn't feel fleshed out. It felt a little inconsistent, but the stealth did feel more consistent in this section. So he snuck around, managed to sneak up and choke a guy out, and I liked what I saw. As a fan of stealth, when it's an option, I'm really hoping this is going to come up quite often, because I'm the type of player that always chooses the stealthy route until things sometimes go sour, which did happen in this case. And after the base was alerted, the player did actually manage to escape and do some more stealthy gameplay to get away, although there were some more scenes of fighting other humans, which was cool. And eventually the player ended up in the room of the leader of this faction. The whole purpose to get here was to, I suppose, sort out the situation and also turn on the water pumps from this faction. So you do meet with the leader and you tell him, hey, I want to turn on the pumps. What the hell is going on here? Why would you do this? Blah, 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 blah. Some shit went down before at the fisheye. The colonel is seemingly confused and he says, hang on, I don't know why that would happen. I don't know, you don't know how these pumps work, so trust me, that's not really how it works. And then you get a radio message from someone else who says, hey, get the job done, do this, blah, blah, blah. Basically, you're in a conflict. Do I trust this leader, he's called the colonel, or do I not trust him? Now, in this particular case, the player chose to not trust him, which led to some more combat, some really cool combat, actually, in this particular situation, and eventually ended with the player turning on, I suppose, the water pumps, or attempting to, and then a cutscene that sort of showed you the results of your decisions and how the city has changed. So I hope that was an okay, sort of in-depth, but spoiler-free summary, but right now I just want to get into the game mechanics. So let's start with the parkour, which really is evolved. They said there are double moves, and I definitely believe them from what I saw. There are very specific moves and animations for certain situations, certain environments that you're climbing through or over or under. You can swing through doors, and even the biggest thing I think for me is not only are there more parkour moves and you have to string them together to make combos, but those combos can also involve combat as well. Wall running is back. Oh no, sorry, it's not back. It is here. We didn't have horizontal wall running in the first game, but we do now. You can actually horizontally run between two walls that are close together, like jump from wall to wall. You can jump off the wall and kick someone. So the combat and the parkour are really well synchronized and integrated, so you can go from one parkour move to a combat move and back to the parkour. It looks very fluid, and I am so impressed with it. Now, there is rope swinging as well around the city. There are these ropes you can swing on to get from one place to another, kind of like Tarzan, I suppose. There's also this rope elevator, I guess I would call it, in certain situations that are set up by the humans. So you hold onto the rope, kick some little thing to activate it, and then it just takes you straight up very quickly to the top of the building, which is pretty cool. And let's take a moment to talk about the grappling hook. I know people had mixed feelings about the grappling hook in the first game, and I will say it is back, but it is also very different. First of all, it kind of looks like a rope. It doesn't look very straight, kind of like Batman just taking you like very linearly straight to the top of a building or something. It's kind of very loose, and you toss it and it's like a rope. You can actually pull objects with the grappling hook now, which is something I wanted in the first game. So a couple of the examples were he used the grappling hook to pull open a vent to climb through it and be stealthy. He also, in a combat situation, used the grappling hook to pull forward a huge like oil barrel, which crushed the enemies underneath and actually like crashed them through the floorboards. Now, along with the updated grappling hook, which seems to have some combat situations as well, you can like throw it and swing on it and kick someone while you're swinging. The grappling hook looks really good. I'm impressed with it. I don't know if it's going to break and you have to keep crafting more. I don't know about that, but the gameplay of it looks very, very good. But along with that, there's also another piece of equipment for traversal, and it is the Paraglider. And you can actually use these in combo. So in the one section we saw the player use the Paraglider, he actually swung across a building from the grappling hook and then deployed the Paraglider to glide across the rest of the distance to the other building. And this isn't like the Pisa suit from the first game. He didn't take like heaps of fall damage and just die. He did land pretty smoothly and roll onto the ground or the surface that he landed on. There are vehicles as well for traversal, for moving around. We've seen trucks. We haven't actually seen the player drive the vehicles yet, though, but we've seen him inside of a vehicle, as I mentioned before. And as I mentioned earlier, there was a sneaking sort of stealth section. At one point, the player snuck up behind a guard and did a stealth choke attack. The controls for this did seem a bit too simple. I saw this from time to time, like pressing one button and it does this big choking animation. To me, I prefer something that's a bit more engaging and involving rather than pressing one button. An example would be the Dishonored series, where you choke people, you sort of you hold one of the buttons to do it, and then it shows you like how long it's going to take, and then you can from there press square to pick up the body or whatever and and dispose of it. But in this case, you just tapped one button and choked him out. I personally hope that there's going to be an option to make this more in-depth. That's what I would personally prefer, but it was cool regardless to sneak up behind someone and choke them out. As I mentioned earlier, UV flares are back, and the UV flashlight is very important. All of the infected at this point, 15 years into the apocalypse, are very UV sensitive. That's why they mostly stay in the dark, and when they do come out in the sun, they are very weakened by those UV rays. And I believe there's a complete lack of antizin at this point, and it's actually UV rays that are helping to make the infection subside within you, which I'm going to try and get a bit more detail about in another interview. Now let's talk about combat and enemies. Now, we didn't really see any directly fighting zombies gameplay. He avoided the zombies when he got into that dark zone. He punched a few off of him, but it didn't really slay many zombies. So we didn't really get to see a lot of that. We did see a lot of human versus human combat, which, as I mentioned, actually was really, really improved. I did notice at one point that one of the human enemies actually grabbed the player and headbutted him so hard that his nose started to actually get really bloody, which was really cool. It's a nice little detail. Drop kicks are back, and they really send humans flying away off of buildings along with zombies. You can tackle zombies out of windows and use them to break your fall damage whilst also killing them at the same time. This looks fantastic. I'm a big fan of just that move in general. It looks so awesome. The player actually, when he was in the room of the leader, before he was trying to turn on the pumps and whatnot, he actually killed a guy who was shooting something at him, and it was like a makeshift projectile weapon. It wasn't an actual gun. So he ran up to his corpse, and it actually gave the player a prompt to steal weapon. Now, this weapon was actually called the Scorpio, and what it did was it shot projectiles, and eventually he ran out of ammunition. So what he did was he flipped the weapon around and used it as a big blunt melee weapon, which was so cool. It's got that double functionality. I'm not quite sure what it was shooting. It didn't seem like actual bullets, but it did one-shot enemies and send them like ragdolling, just like knocked them way back. So it's a very powerful weapon with, I suspect, very limited ammunition, which is why he needed to flip it around and smack some people on the head with it. Now, after shooting some people with the Scorpio and smacking their heads in, the player encountered a huge human enemy with armor and a heavy weapon. He kind of reminded me of a human version of the Goon zombie from the first game, but with more human-like reflexes, right? Less slow. He was like swinging some combos around, which the player was expertly dodging. He did a ground pound, which actually did knock the player back onto the ground and actually made the player drop the Scorpio weapon. And from here, the player didn't pick it back up, which has me wondering, maybe the Scorpio isn't a weapon you can have in your inventory, but it's just something that you once again get when the steal weapon prompt comes up from enemies. I'm not too sure about that, but he then did a move where he swung forward on the grappling hook and kicked the big guy while he was swinging, which threw him off balance and stunned the big enemy and opened him up for more attacks. And after a while of injuring the big guy, he dropped to his knees, and the player decided to finish him off by slashing his throat open, and it was pretty gruesome. Now, at the very end of all this, as I mentioned, there was a cutscene that showed just how much the world had visually changed based on your decisions, and not just visually, but how the people are reacting within the world as well. And let me tell you, it was a dramatic difference. They really did a good job of showing off the transformation of the city through the cutscene, and it ended with a really weird-looking zombie arm sticking out of the ground, and at first it seems like a generic zombie rising from the dead kind of thing. But then some huge spikes suddenly grew out of the zombie's arm, and the demo cut to black. So I guess that's going to be a new type of zombie with like huge spikes sticking out of its body. Oh, I can't wait to find out more about that, because I know you guys want to know about new zombie types, and trust me, I do as well. So there's definitely one walking around with huge spikes sticking out of it, I guess. Now I want to talk about the Q&A session that happened after the gameplay display. So the first question that was asked by the audience was, is this the same soundtrack makers? Is it the same sound design people behind the soundtrack? No, it is not. I believe the guy behind Dying Light 2 soundtrack is Oliver Deriviere. I'm sorry if I butchered that. I obviously did. He's a guy behind, I believe, Plague Tale, Assassin's Creed. He's got a really good track record, and the music did sound fantastic. So you should definitely not be disappointed about that. This is a great thing. I think the music sounded fantastic. an audience member asked, how can you tell where to grapple your hook? You know, you could use it to swing from roofs into combat moves. You could pull barrels. You could pull certain objects. How do you know? And there were actually specific visual cues on the screen. For me personally, it made it a bit too obvious to know what you could pull. I'll probably switch that off because they did mention there is customizable heads-up display. They asked about online co-op. How do the changes in the world sort of happen in co-op? And the answer is that the host makes the decisions, the important decisions at least, and it is the host's world that you will see. So if you join your friend, and that friend who is hosting it, you will see their world, and they will get to make the important decisions, so you can't really troll them and just like ruin their world for them. The weapon, as I mentioned, was called the Scorpio. He gave us the name of it in the Q&A. So yeah, you could shoot people, spin it around, smash people with it. Somebody asked a very good question about saving. You know, can we go back and just redo a decision and experience it on that side? And they said no, it is auto-saving, kind of like the first game. There are no save slots for going back on your decisions. This was very intentional. You have to live with your decisions, and they said that you're only going to experience probably less than 50% of the game on your first playthrough. Side quests can also change things in a very big way. And he said that, so I actually asked him, can we join multiple factions at once, or can we switch between factions? And the answer that I got from Timon was that Aiden is an outsider who doesn't outright join factions. You gain reputation gradually, and it's all on a specific decision-by-decision basis. There's no, hey, I just want to join these guys and just be with these guys. You start off as your own individual independent person, and I suppose you can align yourself with certain factions, but this is done gradually through individual decisions. They mentioned during the Q&A that they're wanting to focus more on stealth being an option, which is great. The player is the moral compass, is a note that I wrote down, which makes sense. You're making these decisions. So I noted before that the big guy that we were fighting actually dropped down to his knees and was no longer attacking you, was in a stunned state, and then the player like slit his throat open. So a lady in the audience asked, can you just leave these enemies and just try and negotiate things, peacefully, but if you have to fight them, do you have to finish them off, or can you just like leave them there? And he said you can leave them there. That's the point, is that you can make decisions. You can try and be non-hostile and non-direct, or you can just wreak havoc, I suppose. I asked about PvP because obviously they were talking about co-op and how the host determines the world and the decisions, and they just said nope. No PvP details yet. They are keeping that shit tight. They are not saying anything about PvP just yet. And this is something we've heard before, but they reminded us that the world map is 4 times bigger than Dying Light 1. That doesn't include the following, by the way. So it's 4 times bigger than the base game without the following expansion. And they also said that the city, which is a pretty simple name, is actually a metaphor for civilization, and it's a fictional city based on European cities. It is not Haran. And that was the end of the Q&A session, and after that, once again, I had a one-on-one interview, which I'm going to keep as a separate video because I don't want this video to be too long. I want the interviews to be their own separate thing, but I got some really great answers to some questions that you probably still have after this explanation. Don't worry, I've got your back, and I've been looking at all of your questions. If you do have any more questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. I will be reading every single one, but there are a couple more interviews coming out, so don't worry, your questions are going to be answered, and I am going to be asking them when you guys can see the gameplay, so don't worry, I've got your back. But thank you so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed listening to this. If I forgot any details, I hope I'll edit them in post, or I'll leave a comment with some additional things, so I'll pin that. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and please stay tuned for more Dying Light 2 content. There's a lot more information coming, and I'm gonna really hassle them about showing you guys gameplay as soon as possible. So thank you once again. Have a wonderful day. But let's talk about combat. Now, as I mentioned, once again, you can string together parkour moves and attacks. So, one example, Carl Crane, oh, fucking Carl Crane.